Welcome back, everyone. The iPhone 4 is probably one of the more important iPhones that Apple has ever made. In my opinion, I think it is the most important iPhone Apple has ever pushed out. And from one iPhone to the other, the 3GS to the 4, this was the biggest upgrade in my opinion. This thing brought so much to the table, and I still think in this day and age, it is a very important iPhone for sure. It brought the flat sides, a front camera, and so many different things, which I'll get into in a second. But if you want to pick up some iPhones I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the front, this thing had a very good 3.5-inch IPS panel, and this was a really good panel coming from the 3GS. It still had pretty much the same amount of bezel, but we did get that front camera as well, which is another pretty big advantage for this specific phone. Now, on the bottom of this iPhone, this is pretty much one of the most important things about this device. It brought the 30-pin connector, which we already had. It still kept that headphone jack, which is still good, but that flat-sided iPhone is something that we finally got brought back last year in 2020 with the iPhone 12s, and it was one of the most requested things of all time, and this iPhone pretty much originated it. Now, when you compare the 3GS to the 4, this was pretty much going from like a kind of cheap feeling iPhone to one of the most premium iPhones that still feels like $1,000 phone in this day and age. And this is, I think, where Apple kind of found their footing from being kind of more of like, focusing on the software and like, oh, look at how different it is and stuff, to showing how premium this phone was. This was the most premium iPhone I think Apple has ever made. And I think the next iPhone that had the same effect of this one was the iPhone 10 that came out in 2017. So this iPhone, beautiful. I love it a lot. And it's still, just from the sides alone, it was so powerful. Now on the back, we did have the glass back, which that in and of itself was another really important thing. Since then, we've gotten glass backs on a lot of different iPhones, but there was a gap from the iPhone 5 to about the iPhone 8 Plus. There weren't really any iPhones that had full glass backs. There were some that kind of had like some glass backs, but we didn't really have it like the iPhone 4 and 4S. So this was an iPhone that brought it. It didn't really have wireless charging or IP certification or anything, but this was a phone that came out in 2010. And when you compare this iPhone against all the competition, this thing had some crazy features ahead of it for sure. So in terms of that, that's a huge highlight. And even though this phone really isn't worth it anymore in terms of using it, I still think it's worth it in terms of a consumer standpoint. I think it's still worth it in terms of pretty much like a collector standpoint. That's pretty much the best way I can put it. Now, talking about the cameras, I can definitely tell you these cameras are not going to wow anybody. These are very outdated lenses. You had a single 5 megapixel camera on the back, and you had a VGA front camera, which I think is like 0.3 megapixels or something. Now, you can record the videos on the back of this phone 720p at 30 frames per second. The front of this phone was 480p. So definitely not the best looking cameras of all time, but even when I recently used it, it really wasn't as bad as you would think. I mean, it's definitely like, I wouldn't use it as an everyday phone, but back in the day, this was a pretty good camera. This was probably the best camera, or one of the best ones of 2010, which was like 12 years ago as of this point. And what's so interesting about the iPhone 4 is that this was the first iPhone to bring the front-facing camera. And this is the most important thing that I could ever say about this phone. How many phones since then have we gotten with front-facing cameras? Even back in 2010, there were still a lot of phones being made that didn't really have front-facing cameras. You do have to remember that. Now, a lot of the flagships had it at that point, but this was the first iPhone to bring it. And since then, a lot of iPhones, and every single iPhone from that time pretty much had a front-facing camera. So when it comes down to that, huge asset. The quality really isn't that good anymore. I probably wouldn't recommend using this phone in terms of that, but it is still a very interesting phone just because of the camera setup. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. Now, in terms of the software standpoint, this device originally came out with iOS 4. It did go up to iOS 7.1.2, and there were a lot of features that were being added with each iteration of the software. And iOS 7 is said to be one of the most important updates of all time. Now, it definitely wasn't an amazing experience on the iPhone 4. Even now on my iPhone 4, I'm still experiencing a lot of issues, a lot of bugs, and one of the most annoying things ever that Apple still hasn't fixed is the pop-ups. There are so many pop-ups that come up that if you ever try to do something weird on your iPhone or even something normal, it'll just throw a bunch of pop-ups and you have to spend like 10 seconds clicking out of all of them. But since then, maybe Apple's fixed it a little bit, but iOS 7 is one of the more important versions of software. Now, this thing is not getting updates anymore. It hasn't gotten updates in many years, so that's another pretty big thing to keep in mind. When you're having a phone like an iPhone 4 in this day and age, it's completely, I mean, you can't really do anything with it. You can't even really install apps on this thing anymore. However, this thing is pretty important when it comes down to the longevity of it. So that's another pretty big thing to keep in mind as well. When you have a phone like an iPhone 4 this day and age, if you have it on iOS 4, it's a collector's item. Even if you have it on iOS 7, it's still a collector's item too. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up in terms of the software standpoint. Now, in terms of the performance, I mean, this is going to be crazy. This thing had the Apple A4 chip inside of it with 512 megabytes of RAM, so half a gig of RAM. And this is what I'll tell you. I'm assuming that back in 2010, this was probably the fastest iPhone Apple has ever made, and this was probably one of the fastest phones of 2010. And maybe even going into 2011 and 2012, this was probably one of the best performing phones of that era. Unfortunately now, this phone is very slow, and if we're comparing it to any of the iPhones that have came out probably within the last 5 years, those things are much faster than this iPhone. However, that isn't to take away what the iPhone 4 brought at that time. It brought a lot of different cool features, and when I held my iPhone 4 and I was making videos and everything with it, I'm still surprised how great feeling the iPhone 4 is. It's definitely not fast, it's definitely not smooth, and it does take me quite a bit of time to do basic tasks on this thing, but I'm not really complaining about it because I know how old this phone was. If Apple released a phone this day and age that performed like this, I would be so upset. But the fact that this is like a 12-year-old phone that you can buy for like $10 probably, I'm totally okay with it. I wouldn't use it as an everyday phone, but it is pretty interesting how good of a job Apple did at that time. So I will tell you, I would not use an iPhone 4 anymore, but it is pretty interesting how good of a device this is still from that type of standpoint. So for basic tasks, this thing doesn't really do that good of a job. For heavy intensive games, this thing really doesn't do a good job. But if I had to use this phone, I would not use it. I would not have a good time. But maybe like an iPhone 5 or definitely an iPhone 5, I could use this day and age. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it up there. Now this phone also had a 1420 mAh battery, which is another really interesting thing about this phone. The fact that this thing actually had a pretty decent sized battery at that time was actually pretty interesting. Now my iPhone 4 does not last that long at all. It lasts probably for like 2 hours, 3 hours, barely, and by the time I'm like using it and everything, it pretty much shuts down randomly, and that doesn't really have anything to do with the iPhone 4, more so with the battery health of this device. So again, another pretty big thing to keep in mind. But in terms of the battery back in 2010, it was probably a really good battery life that people probably could use on like iOS 4. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But ultimately, to kind of sum up this video, I obviously don't think the iPhone 4 is worth using anymore. This is a pretty legendary device though, just because of what it brought to the table. Without a doubt, the iPhone 4, in my opinion, is the most important iPhone of all time. Either this one, maybe the iPhone 10, but this thing brought the front-facing camera. It brought the flat sides. It brought the glass back. And those three things in and of itself make this phone a legend. We've pretty much gotten the iPhone 4 revived with the iPhone 12 series, and when I look at the future of all the iPhones, they are going to be repurposing what the iPhone 4 originally brought. When I hold my iPhone 4 and I hold my iPhone 13, I feel like there are so many similarities versus when I hold my iPhone 7 and I hold an iPhone 12. There's not that many similarities. When I hold an iPhone 7 and 13, same exact thing. So even though these phones are years and years apart, I feel like they're so similar in so many different ways. So that's pretty much how I feel about the iPhone 4 today. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.